The words hit me like ice water. Mom, we think it's time you let us handle your finances. You're getting confused about money. My daughter Sarah said it so gently, so patronizingly, while my son Marcus nodded in agreement from across my kitchen table. They had no idea I'd been listening to their phone calls for weeks, plotting to declare me incompetent. They had no idea about the accounts they'd never seen, the investments they'd never heard of, or the financial empire I'd built in complete silence. But they were about to find out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Della Gibson, 74 years old, and for the past 6 months, my children have been treating me like I'm sliding into dementia every time I mention money. It started small. Sarah would correct me when I mentioned grocery prices, insisting I was remembering wrong. Marcus would exchange those looks with his wife when I talked about my monthly expenses, the kind of glances that said, "Poor mom, she's losing it." They'd taken to speaking about me in hushed tones when they thought I couldn't hear, using words like concerning, and decline, and intervention. The kitchen where we sat had been the heart of my home for 37 years. The same oak table where I'd helped them with homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays, where I'd signed their college loan papers with a steady hand and a clear mind. Now they sat across from me like I was a stranger they needed to manage, rather than the woman who'd raised them alone after their father died in a construction accident when Sarah was 12 and Marcus was 9. Sarah cleared her throat and pulled out a folder, the kind lawyers use for important documents. She was 42 now, a real estate agent with perfectly styled blonde hair and a wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars. Marcus, 39, worked in corporate sales and had inherited his father's broad shoulders but none of his warmth. Both of them had done well for themselves, and I was proud of that. I'd made sure they could. "We've been talking," Sarah began, her voice taking on that careful tone people use with children and the elderly, "and we think you might benefit from some help managing your day-to-day expenses. Nothing major, just someone to help keep track of bills, maybe organize your banking." I sipped my coffee from the same blue ceramic mug I'd used every morning for 2 decades, and studied their faces. Sarah's lips were pressed into what she probably thought was a caring smile. Marcus fidgeted with his phone, clearly uncomfortable but going along with whatever plan they'd hatched. "What makes you think I need help?" I asked, keeping my voice level. They exchanged one of those looks again, and Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Well, last week you said your electric bill was only $43, but Marcus looked it up online and it was actually $87. And remember when you insisted you'd paid the property taxes early, but then we found the notice still on your counter?" I had said my electric bill was $43, because that's what it was after the solar panel rebate I'd never mentioned to them. I had paid my property taxes early, from an account they didn't know existed. But I didn't correct them, I just waited. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice gentler than his sister's but no less condescending. "Mom, we love you. We just want to make sure you're protected. There are people out there who take advantage of seniors, and sometimes when our minds start to slip a little, we don't notice things we used to. Our minds start to slip." I almost laughed. My mind was sharper than it had been in years, sharpened by necessity and decades of careful planning they knew nothing about. Instead, I set down my mug and folded my hands on the table. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Sarah opened the folder and slid a set of papers across the table toward me. "We've spoken with an attorney about setting up a power of attorney arrangement. Nothing dramatic, just something that would let us help you with banking and bills. We could set up automatic payments, maybe consolidate some of your accounts to make things simpler." I glanced at the papers without picking them up. Legal documents, professionally prepared, probably expensive. They'd been planning this for a while. "We know it's a big step," Marcus added quickly, "but we think it would give you peace of mind. No more worrying about whether bills got paid or if you're remembering things correctly. We'd handle all of that. Peace of mind." As if my mind hadn't been at peace for years, carefully calculating and planning while they assumed I was deteriorating. As if I hadn't been 3 steps ahead of them since they were toddlers. I looked around my kitchen, taking in the small details they'd never paid attention to. The new stainless steel appliances I'd installed 6 months ago, paid for in cash. The granite countertops that had replaced the old Formica last spring. The custom blinds that blocked the view of my driveway, where I kept my 2-year-old Honda Accord that I'd also paid for in cash. They saw an old woman in an old house with bills she might be confused about. They had no idea what they were really looking at. "This is sudden," I said finally. "We've been worried for a while," Sarah admitted. "Remember at Christmas when you said you couldn't afford to contribute to the family vacation fund? We knew something was wrong because you've always been so generous. It just seemed like you might be having trouble keeping track of your money." I remembered Christmas clearly. They'd wanted me to chip in $2,000 for a family trip to Cancun, a trip that would cost me far more than the contribution when I factored in my own expenses. I told them I couldn't afford it not because I didn't have the money, but because I didn't want to spend it on a vacation with people who were already planning to strip away my autonomy. But they'd interpreted it as confusion, as inability to manage my finances. Marcus leaned back in his chair, and I caught a glimpse of his expensive watch, the one he'd bought after his last promotion. "We know this is hard, Mom. We're not trying to take over your life. We just want to help." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. And honestly, it would be easier for all of us. You wouldn't have to worry about keeping track of everything, and we'd know you were taken care of." Taken care of? Like I was an invalid, instead of the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them in good schools, who'd saved every penny I could to make sure they never went without, who'd built something substantial while they were busy building their own lives. I picked up the legal documents and scanned the first page. It was comprehensive, giving them authority over my bank accounts, my investments, my property decisions. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, signed over to 2 people who thought I was too confused to handle $43 electric bills. "I need time to think about this," I said, setting the papers back down. Sarah's face fell slightly. "Mom, there's really nothing to think about. It's just a safety net." "A safety net assumes I'm going to fall," I replied. "I haven't fallen yet." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "But wouldn't it be better to have it in place before anything happens? Prevention is better than reaction, right?" I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 74 years in my knees but keeping my spine straight. "I appreciate your concern, I really do. But I'm not ready to sign away my financial independence based on a few misunderstandings about utility bills." Sarah and Marcus exchanged another look, this one more frustrated than concerned. They'd expected me to be grateful, relieved even. They'd expected me to see this as a gift rather than what it actually was, a polite coup. "Just think about it," Sarah said, standing as well. "We're not going anywhere. When you're ready to talk about this seriously, we're here." After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen and stared at the legal documents they'd left behind. The house felt different with them gone, quieter but also somehow lighter. I'd raised them to be independent, to think for themselves, to question authority. I'd apparently done too good a job, because now they were questioning mine. I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet, pushing aside the winter coats I rarely needed in Arizona to reveal a small safe built into the wall. Inside were documents they'd never seen, account statements from banks they didn't know about, investment portfolios that would probably shock them. I pulled out a folder and carried it back to the kitchen table. For the past 15 years, ever since their father died and left me with a modest life insurance payout, I'd been quietly building something. Not just saving money, but truly building wealth. I'd started small, researching companies, learning about dividends and growth stocks. I'd taken classes at the community college, taught myself about real estate investment trusts and municipal bonds. While Sarah and Marcus were building their careers and starting their families, I was building a financial foundation they couldn't even imagine. The life insurance money had been the seed, but my real wealth came from careful planning and patient investing. I'd bought rental properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods, sold them at the right time, reinvested the profits. I'd discovered I had a gift for reading market trends, for seeing potential where others saw risk. My portfolio now included stocks, bonds, real estate investments, and 3 rental properties that generated steady monthly income. But I'd kept it all private, partly out of natural caution, and partly because I'd learned early that people treat you differently when they think you have money. I'd wanted my children to build their own lives, make their own successes, without thinking they had a safety net to fall back on. I'd wanted them to be self-reliant. Now that strategy was backfiring. Because they had no idea about my real financial situation, they assumed I was struggling. Because they'd never seen evidence of wealth, they interpreted my careful spending as inability to spend. Because I'd been discreet about my success, they thought I was failing. I opened the folder and spread the most recent statements across the table. My investment account with Schwab showed a balance of just over $800,000. The checking account I used for daily expenses held about $15,000, enough to cover several months of bills without worry. My savings account, which I used as a buffer for larger purchases, contained $42,000. The 3 rental properties were worth approximately $600,000 combined and generated about $4,000 in monthly rental income. In total, my net worth was approaching $1.5 million. I was not confused about money. I was exceptionally good with money. But my children saw an elderly woman who said her electric bill was $43 and assumed she was losing her grip on reality. They saw someone who declined to contribute to expensive family vacations and interpreted it as financial incapacity rather than financial wisdom. They saw what they expected to see: a mother who needed their help rather than a woman who'd been successfully managing substantial wealth for over a decade. I gathered the statements back into the folder and returned it to the safe, then sat back down at the kitchen table with their legal documents. The irony was almost amusing. They wanted power of attorney to protect me from financial mistakes. But the only financial mistake I could see was trusting them with this conversation in the first place. That evening, I called my financial advisor, Janet Rodriguez, whom I'd been working with for 8 years. Janet was about Marcus's age, sharp and no nonsense, and one of the few people who knew the full scope of my financial situation. "Della, good to hear from you," Janet said when she picked up. "I was just reviewing your portfolio. The tech stocks are performing even better than we projected. Janet, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Do I seem confused about money to you? In any of our meetings, have I ever appeared to be losing my mental sharpness?" There was a pause. "That's an odd question. Why do you ask?" I told her about the conversation with Sarah and Marcus, about their concerns and their proposed solution. Janet listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Della," she said finally, "in 8 years of working together, you've made exactly one financial decision I disagreed with, and you were right about that one too."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
You understand market fluctuations better than clients half your age. You ask the right questions, you read the reports I send you, and you've built a portfolio that most people would envy. If you're confused about money, then I need to find a new profession. So you think I'm handling my finances appropriately? I think you're handling them brilliantly. The question is, why do your children think otherwise? I explained about the electric bill, about the property taxes, about their interpretation of my careful spending as inability to spend. Janet made thoughtful sounds as I talked. "It sounds like they're seeing the symptoms of careful money management and interpreting them as signs of decline," she said. "Classic case of people not understanding what they're looking at." "What would you do in my position?" "That depends. Do you want to maintain your privacy, or do you want to educate them?" It was a good question. For years, I'd valued my financial privacy. I'd enjoyed being underestimated, enjoyed the freedom that came with people not knowing what I was worth. But now that privacy was being used against me, twisted into evidence of incompetence. "I think," I said slowly, "it might be time for some education." After I hung up with Janet, I sat in my living room and thought about my late husband, David. He'd been a good man, hardworking and honest, but not particularly sophisticated about money. He'd believed in steady jobs and savings accounts, in paying bills on time, and maybe setting aside a little for retirement. He would have been amazed by what I'd accomplished in the 15 years since his death, but he also would have understood why I'd kept it quiet. David had always said that the best surprise was one that solved a problem before anyone knew the problem existed. I'd been planning to surprise Sarah and Marcus eventually, probably when I got much older or when they faced some financial crisis that I could help resolve. I'd imagined myself as the fairy godmother, appearing with solutions when they needed them most. But they'd forced my hand. Instead of waiting for them to need help, I was going to have to help them understand that I was the last person who needed financial management. I spent the next morning organizing my documents, preparing for a conversation I'd never planned to have. I pulled statements from all my accounts, printed out property deeds, gathered tax returns that showed income streams they'd never heard of. I made copies of everything and arranged them in a presentation that would be impossible to misunderstand. Then I called both of my children and asked them to come over that evening for dinner. "I've thought about what you said yesterday," I told them. "We need to talk." Sarah arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the same cautiously optimistic expression she'd worn as a child when she thought she might be getting the birthday present she'd asked for. Marcus came 20 minutes later with his wife, Jennifer, whom he'd apparently briefed on the situation because she gave me one of those sympathetic smiles people reserve for the elderly and infirm. I served them my grandmother's pot roast recipe, the same meal I'd made for special occasions throughout their childhoods. We ate with polite conversation about their jobs, their social lives, the weather. Jennifer complimented the meal and asked for the recipe, though I doubted she'd ever make it. Sarah talked about a house she was showing to wealthy clients from California. Marcus mentioned his latest sales numbers. I waited until after dessert to bring out the folder. "You wanted to talk about my finances," I said, setting the thick manila folder on the dining room table. "So let's talk." Sarah straightened in her chair, probably preparing for a conversation about bill organization and automatic payments. Marcus set down his coffee cup and gave me his full attention. Jennifer looked politely interested. I opened the folder and pulled out the first set of documents, my most recent investment account statement. I slid it across the table to Sarah, who glanced at it, looked confused, and then looked again more carefully. "This is..." she started, then stopped. "My Charles Schwab account," I finished. "As you can see, the current balance is $837,412. Sarah's eyes widened. Marcus leaned over to look at the statement, and his expression shifted from confusion to shock. "Mom, this can't be right," he said. "This says you have almost $1 million in investments." "Not almost," I corrected. "But that's just one account." I pulled out the next set of documents, bank statements from 3 different banks, showing checking and savings accounts with balances that totaled just over $60,000. "These are my liquid accounts," I explained, checking for daily expenses, savings for larger purchases or emergencies. Jennifer had gone very quiet. Sarah was staring at the statements like they were written in a foreign language. "But how?" Sarah asked. "Where did this money come from?" I pulled out the next folder, property deeds and rental agreements for 3 small apartment buildings I owned in different parts of the city. "Real estate," I said simply. "I started with your father's life insurance money and bought my first rental property 12 years ago, a small duplex that needed work. I fixed it up, rented it out, saved the rental income, and bought another property, then another." Marcus was flipping through the rental agreements, his face growing paler with each page. "These show monthly rent payments of over $4,000 total. $4,200 currently, though I'm raising the rent on the Maple Street property next month." Sarah finally found her voice. "Mom, are you telling us you're a millionaire?" I pulled out a single sheet of paper I'd prepared that morning, a summary of all my assets, their current values, and my total net worth. As of yesterday's closing prices, my net worth is $1,473,826. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Jennifer looked like she might need medical attention. Marcus was staring at the summary sheet as if it might burst into flames. Sarah's mouth was open. "I don't understand," Sarah said finally. "If you have all this money, why did you say you couldn't afford the family vacation? Why do you drive that old car? Why do you act like you're worried about money?" I leaned back in my chair and studied my children's faces. They looked like they'd just discovered I had a secret identity. Which, in a way, I suppose I did. I said I couldn't afford the vacation because I didn't want to spend $2,000 on a trip with people who were planning to declare me mentally incompetent, I said calmly. I drive a reliable car that's paid for because I don't need to impress anyone with my transportation choices. And I don't act worried about money, I act careful with money. There's a difference. Marcus was shaking his head slowly. But all those times you seemed confused about bills, about expenses. I was never confused, I interrupted. You were. When I said my electric bill was $43, that was the amount after my solar panel rebate. When I said I'd paid my property taxes early, I had, from an account you didn't know about. When I declined expensive family activities, it wasn't because I couldn't afford them. It was because I chose not to afford them. Sarah was reading through the investment statements again, her real estate training helping her understand the scope of what she was seeing. Mom, some of these investments are really sophisticated. This isn't just putting money in a savings account. No, it's not. I spent years educating myself about investing. I took classes, read books, worked with a financial advisor. I learned about market analysis and asset allocation and risk management. I built this portfolio carefully, deliberately, over 15 years. Jennifer finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We had no idea. That was intentional, I said. I wanted you to build your own lives without thinking you had a wealthy mother to fall back on. I wanted you to be self-reliant, independent. I wanted to surprise you someday when you needed help, not when you thought I needed help. Marcus set down the papers and looked directly at me. So when we came here yesterday talking about power of attorney, you were essentially asking a millionaire to hand over her financial management to two people who thought she was confused about $43 electric bills. The irony hung in the air like smoke. Sarah was the first to laugh, a short, disbelieving sound. Oh my God, we're the confused ones. I nodded, spectacularly confused. Marcus buried his face in his hands. Mom, I am so sorry. We thought we were helping. I know you did, but you were helping based on assumptions, not facts. You saw what you expected to see instead of looking at what was actually happening. Sarah was still studying the financial documents. How did we get it so wrong? Because you don't know me as well as you think you do, I said gently. You know me as your mother, the woman who raised you, who worried about your homework and your dating and your career choices. You don't know me as Della Gibson, investor and property owner and financial planner, because I never let you see that side of me. Jennifer looked up from the rental agreement she'd been examining. Why now? Why show us this now? Because you forced my hand. When someone tries to have you declared financially incompetent, you have two choices. You can let them, or you can prove them wrong. I chose to prove you wrong. Marcus was shaking his head again, but this time it seemed to be in admiration rather than disbelief. 15 years. You built all this in 15 years. I had good teachers and a lot of motivation. Your father's death taught me that financial security isn't something you can take for granted. I decided to build something that couldn't be taken away. Sarah closed the folder of bank statements and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a child. Pure admiration mixed with a little fear. What happens now? I gathered the documents back into neat stacks. Now you go home and think about what you've learned. About me, about assumptions, about the difference between helping someone and managing them. And the power of attorney? Marcus asked. Gets torn up, I said firmly. I am not confused about money. I am exceptionally good with money. And I will continue managing my own finances until I decide otherwise. As they prepared to leave, Sarah hugged me tighter than she had in months. I'm proud of you, she said. And I'm sorry we didn't see it. Marcus hung back after the others had gone to their cars. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. Were you ever planning to tell us? About the money, I mean. I considered the question. Someday, when you needed to know, or when I got too old to manage it myself. I thought I'd have more time to decide when that someday would be. He nodded slowly. And now? Now you know. The question is what you do with that knowledge. After they left, I sat alone in my dining room, surrounded by the evidence of my secret life as a successful investor. The house felt different again, but this time it felt more honest. For 15 years, I'd been two people, the careful mother and the savvy businesswoman. Now, for better or worse, I was just one person again. I thought about David, about what he would have said if he could have seen tonight's conversation. He probably would have laughed at the looks on our children's faces when they realized their confused mother was worth more than both of them combined. He also would have understood why I'd kept it secret for so long. But secrets have their own cost, and tonight I'd paid it. My children would never look at me the same way again. They'd never again assume they knew what I was thinking, or what I needed. They'd learned that people can surprise you, even people you've known your whole life. I gathered up all the financial documents and returned them to the safe in my bedroom closet. Tomorrow, I would call Janet and tell her about tonight's revelation. I would probably need to have some more detailed conversations with Sarah and Marcus about my long-term financial plans, now that they knew those plans existed. But tonight, I was content to sit in my kitchen with a cup of tea and remember the looks on their faces when they realized they'd tried to manage someone who had been managing just fine without them for longer than they'd imagined possible. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd been worried I was too confused to handle money, and it turned out I was the only one in the family who wasn't confused about money at all. The week following my financial revelation brought an uncomfortable silence from both Sarah and Marcus. No phone calls checking on my well-being, no surprise visits with concerned expressions, no more discussions about my supposed confusion. It was as if they needed time to recalibrate their entire understanding of who I was, and frankly, I needed time to adjust to being seen clearly for the first time in years. I spent those quiet days doing what I'd always done, managing my investments, reviewing market reports, and maintaining my properties. But now these activities felt different, less like secrets, and more like the natural rhythm of my actual life. I no longer had to hide my financial newspapers, or quickly close my laptop when they called. I could simply be myself. Wednesday morning brought the first crack in their silence. Sarah called while I was reviewing quarterly reports from my rental management company, her voice tentative in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager asking to borrow the car. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything you showed us the other night," she began carefully. "I have so many questions, but I don't even know where to start." I set aside my paperwork and gave her my full attention. "Start wherever feels natural." "Okay, well, first I have to ask, are you angry with us for assuming you needed help?" The question surprised me with its directness. Sarah had always been diplomatic, careful with her words in a way that sometimes made real conversation difficult. "I'm not angry," I said, considering my feelings as I spoke. "I'm disappointed that you assumed incompetence rather than asking questions, but I understand why you made the assumptions you did. We feel terrible about it. Marcus barely slept last night. He keeps saying we were about to treat you like you had dementia when you were actually running circles around us financially." I almost smiled at that image. Your brother always was dramatic. "Mom, can I ask you something that might sound rude?" "Go ahead." "Why didn't you ever tell us you were good with money? I mean, really good. When we were growing up, you always seemed to worry about expenses, about whether we could afford things. Was that all an act?" This was the question I'd been expecting, and I'd spent the past few days thinking about how to answer it honestly. It wasn't an act. When you were children, money was tight. Your father's death left us with bills and uncertainty, and every dollar mattered. I did worry about expenses because I had to. But somewhere along the way, I stopped just worrying and started learning. When did that change happen? Gradually, then suddenly. I remember the exact moment I decided to become serious about investing. You were in college, Marcus was finishing high school, and I was looking at retirement accounts that wouldn't sustain me for more than a few years. I realized that worrying about money wasn't going to solve anything, but understanding money might. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "So you educated yourself?" "Extensively. I treated it like a job, because in many ways it was. I spent hours every day reading about markets, studying successful investors, learning about different types of assets. I made mistakes early on, small ones that taught me valuable lessons. And you never thought to include us in any of this? I leaned back in my chair, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder outside my kitchen window. Sarah, think about your own life. When you started your real estate business, did you call me every day to discuss market conditions and pricing strategies? Well, no, but that's different. Is it? You built expertise in your field and used it to create success. You didn't need your mother's input on every decision. I did the same thing with investing. But we're your family. We could have celebrated your successes with you. Could you have? Really? Or would you have worried that I was taking too many risks, making decisions beyond my capabilities? Would you have assumed I was being taken advantage of by financial advisors or making emotional choices about money? The silence that followed told me I'd hit close to home. Finally, Sarah sighed. You're probably right. We would have worried. I know you would have. And that worry would have become interference, and that interference would have limited what I could accomplish. I needed the freedom to succeed or fail based on my own judgment. So you protected your independence by hiding your success. I protected my independence by maintaining my privacy. There's a difference. We talked for another 20 minutes, with Sarah asking detailed questions about my investment strategy and timeline. Her real estate background helped her understand the property investments, though she was impressed by the sophistication of my stock portfolio. By the end of the call, she sounded less like a daughter managing a declining parent, and more like a colleague seeking advice. Mom, can I ask you one more favor? Of course. Would you be willing to have lunch with me sometime this week? Not to talk about family stuff or check on your well-being or anything like that. I just want to get to know this side of you better. The investor side. I found myself smiling genuinely for the first time since this whole situation began. I'd like that very much. We scheduled lunch for Friday at a quiet restaurant downtown, the kind of place where business deals were discussed over expensive salads. It felt appropriate for the conversation we were going to have. Thursday brought a different kind of call, this one from Marcus. His approach was characteristically more direct than his sister's, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath his usual confidence. Mom, I need to apologize properly for what happened on Monday. Jennifer and I talked about it for hours after we got home, and we both feel like complete idiots. Apology accepted, though I hope you learned something from feeling like idiots. We did. We learned that assumptions are dangerous, especially when they involve people you love. We also learned that we don't know you as well as we thought we did. I was folding laundry while we talked, a mundane task that felt grounding after days of intense family conversations. You know me as your mother, Marcus. That's not a small thing. But it's not the only thing I am. That's what Jennifer said. She pointed out that we never asked about your interests outside of being our parent. We never asked what you did with your time when we weren't around, what goals you had, what you were passionate about. Your wife is very perceptive. She is. And she's also mortified that we almost convinced a millionaire to hand over her financial decision-making to us. She said it's like offering to teach Einstein basic math. I laughed, despite myself. Jennifer has a gift for analogies. Mom, can I ask you something about the money? Ask away. Are you planning to leave it all to us? Is this our inheritance we just learned about? The question caught me off guard, partly because of its bluntness, and partly because I hadn't fully considered the inheritance implications of my revelation. Why do you ask? Because if it is, then we need to have a completely different conversation about how we treat you and what our responsibilities are. And if it's not, then we need to have a different conversation about our expectations and assumptions. I set down the shirt I was folding and gave his question the serious consideration it deserved. Marcus, I'm 74 years old and in good health. I'm planning to live for a long time and to continue growing my wealth during that time. Whatever inheritance you and Sarah eventually receive will depend on many factors, including how my investments perform, what kind of care I might need as I age, and what charitable interests I develop. So we shouldn't assume anything. You should assume I'll make thoughtful decisions based on circumstances that don't exist yet. But no, you shouldn't assume anything specific about amounts or timelines. Fair enough. Can I ask one more thing? Of course. Would you be willing to teach me some of what you've learned? Not because I want to manage your money or because I think you need help, but because I realize I don't know nearly enough about investing, and you're apparently an expert. This request surprised me more than Sarah's lunch invitation. Marcus had always been focused on earning money through his sales career, but he'd never shown much interest in growing money through investments. Are you sure? It's not a casual hobby, Marcus. Serious investing requires serious commitment, I'm sure. Jennifer and I have been talking about our long-term financial goals, and we realized we're not as prepared for retirement as we should be. We've been putting money in basic savings accounts and a simple 401k, but after seeing what you've accomplished, we think we could be doing more. We could start with some basic education, I said slowly. I could recommend some books, maybe walk you through how I analyze potential investments. I'd appreciate that. And Mom? Yes. I'm proud of you. I know I should have said that on Monday night, but I was too shocked to process everything properly. What you've built is really impressive. After I hung up with Marcus, I sat in my living room and thought about how dramatically the family dynamic had shifted in just a few days. For years, Sarah and Marcus had seen me as someone who needed their guidance and protection. Now they were asking for my guidance and expertise. The reversal was almost dizzying. Friday's lunch with Sarah proved to be one of the most interesting conversations we'd had in years. She arrived at the restaurant with a notepad and pen, approaching our meal like a business meeting. I appreciated her seriousness. I've been doing research since our phone call, she began after we'd ordered. I looked up some of the stocks in your portfolio, and several of them have performed exceptionally well over the past few years. How did you identify those opportunities? I sipped my iced tea and considered how to explain a process that had become instinctive through years of practice. I started by learning to read financial statements, understanding what different metrics meant and how they related to a company's actual health. Then I learned to identify trends, both in individual industries and in the broader market. But how do you know which trends matter and which ones are just noise? Experience mostly, and accepting that I'll be wrong sometimes. The key is to be wrong in small ways and right in big ways. Sarah took notes as I explained my approach to research, how I used multiple sources to verify information, how I balanced growth potential against risk factors. She asked intelligent questions that showed she was thinking seriously about the concepts rather than just collecting interesting facts. I have to admit, she said over dessert, part of me is wondering if I chose the wrong career. Real estate has been good to me, but what you've accomplished with investing is remarkable. Real estate is investing, Sarah. You're already in the business of analyzing markets, understanding value, and making strategic decisions about assets. The principles aren't that different. I never thought about it that way. Maybe that's something you could explore. Real estate investment trusts, commercial properties, development opportunities. Your professional knowledge gives you advantages in those areas that most investors don't have. I could see her mind working as she considered the possibilities. Could we talk more about this sometime? Maybe you could look at some properties I'm considering and give me your perspective on their investment potential. I'd enjoy that very much. We spent another hour talking about market analysis and investment strategy before Sarah finally glanced at her watch and realized she'd been at lunch for 3 hours. As we prepared to leave, she hesitated. Mom, can I tell you something that might sound strange? Go ahead. I feel like I'm meeting you for the first time. Like I've been talking to someone I thought was my mother, but now I'm talking to my actual mother. Does that make sense? I considered her words carefully. It makes perfect sense. You've been talking to the version of me you expected to see, rather than the version of me that actually exists. Why didn't you correct us sooner? Because the version you expected to see wasn't entirely wrong. I am your mother. I do care about your well-being and want to be involved in your lives. I just happen to also be other things that you didn't know about. Other things like being a financial genius. I laughed. I wouldn't go that far, but yes, other things like being competent with money and capable of making my own decisions. That weekend, Marcus called to ask if he could bring Jennifer over for what he called Investing 101. I agreed, and Sunday afternoon found the three of us sitting around my dining room table with basic investment books, financial calculators, and printouts of sample portfolios. Jennifer, it turned out, had a natural aptitude for analyzing risk versus reward. She asked penetrating questions about diversification strategies. and seemed to intuitively understand concepts that had taken me months to grasp when I was learning. Marcus was more methodical, taking careful notes and asking me to repeat explanations until he fully understood them. I think we should start small, I advised them. Pick 1 or 2 individual stocks to research thoroughly, and maybe put a small amount into a broad market index fund to get comfortable with the process. How small is small? Marcus asked. Small enough that if you lose it all, it won't affect your lifestyle or your sleep. The point is to learn, not to get rich quickly. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. It's like learning to drive. You start in parking lots, not on the freeway. Exactly. We spent 2 hours going through the basics of stock analysis, and I sent them home with homework. Research 3 companies they found interesting and present their findings to me the following weekend. It felt good to share knowledge I'd accumulated over years of solitary study. But the most significant conversation of the week came Tuesday evening, when both Sarah and Marcus asked if they could come over together. They arrived with serious expressions and what appeared to be prepared remarks. Mom, Sarah began, we owe you more than an apology. We owe you a complete reset of how we approach our relationship with you. Marcus nodded. We've been treating you like someone who needed our care and management when you've actually been thriving on your own in ways we never imagined. I gestured for them to sit down at the kitchen table where this whole revelation had begun a week earlier. What kind of reset are you thinking about? For starters, Sarah said, no more checking up on you unless you ask us to. No more assuming you need help with anything unless you specifically request help. Number more making decisions about what's best for you without consulting you, Marcus added. And no more treating your choices as symptoms of confusion just because we don't understand them. Those sound like reasonable changes, I agreed. What else? Sarah pulled out a folded piece of paper. We wrote down some questions we want to ask you, not because we're worried about you, but because we realized we don't know much about your actual life. Such as, what do you do with your time when we're not around? What are your goals for the next 5 years? What interests you that we've never asked about? What kind of relationship do you want to have with us as adults, rather than as your children who need guidance? These were thoughtful questions, the kind that acknowledged me as a complete person rather than just their mother. Those are good questions. What prompted them? Marcus shifted in his chair. Jennifer pointed out that we've been having the same conversations with you for years. We talk about our jobs, our social lives, our plans, and then we ask about your health and whether you need anything. We never ask about your interests or your goals because we assumed you didn't have any beyond being our mother. That's a fair observation. So we want to start over, Sarah said. We want to get to know Della Gibson, the investor, the property owner, the person who built something impressive while we weren't paying attention. I looked at my children, really looked at them, and saw something I hadn't seen in years. Genuine curiosity about who I was as a person. I'd like that too. We spent the next 2 hours talking about things we'd never discussed before. I told them about my morning routine of reading financial reports over coffee, about the satisfaction I got from finding undervalued stocks, about my plans to eventually establish a scholarship fund for women studying finance. They told me about aspects of their own lives they'd never shared, professional challenges and personal goals that went beyond the surface-level updates we usually exchanged. Mom, Marcus said as they were preparing to leave, can I ask you something that's been bothering me all week? Of course. When we brought those power of attorney documents over here, were you hurt? Or were you just angry? I thought about his question, remembering the emotions I'd felt sitting at this same table a week ago. I was both. But mostly I was disappointed. You were asking me to sign away my autonomy based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I am and what I'm capable of. That must have felt terrible. It felt like being erased, I said honestly. Like all the growth and accomplishment and independence I'd built over 15 years didn't matter, because you couldn't see it. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We see you now? Yes, I said. I think you finally do. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen and reflected on the week that had changed everything. 7 days ago, my children had seen me as a declining elderly woman who needed their management. Tonight, they'd left my house having acknowledged me as a competent adult with my own expertise and interests. The transformation hadn't been easy for any of us. Sarah and Marcus had to confront their own assumptions and biases, while I had to give up the privacy and independence I'd cultivated for years. But the result felt more honest than our previous relationship had been. I thought about the power of perception. How the same actions could be interpreted as confusion or competence depending on what the observer expected to see. My careful spending had looked like inability to spend. My privacy about finances had looked like confusion about finances. My independence had looked like isolation. But now the frame had shifted. My careful spending looked like financial wisdom. My privacy looked like discretion. My independence looked like self-sufficiency. Same actions, completely different interpretation. The difference was knowledge. Once Sarah and Marcus understood my actual financial situation, they could no longer interpret my behavior through the lens of decline and confusion. They had to see my choices as deliberate, rather than symptomatic. It made me wonder how many other elderly people were being misunderstood by well-meaning family members, who saw symptoms where there were actually strategies, problems where there was actually planning. How many competent adults were being managed by children who couldn't see past their own expectations. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Eleanor Martinez, a woman I'd met at a financial planning seminar 2 years earlier. Eleanor was about my age and had mentioned during one of our conversations that her daughter was constantly worried about her mother's spending habits. Eleanor, it's Della Gibson. I hope I'm not calling too late. Della, not at all. I was just reading the Wall Street Journal. How are you? I'm well. I wanted to ask you about something. Are you still having those conversations with your daughter about your finances? Eleanor sighed. Every month. She thinks I'm being reckless with my retirement money because I've been taking some investment risks she doesn't understand. Have you ever shown her your portfolio performance? She wouldn't understand it. She sees risk as inherently bad, regardless of the returns. I told Eleanor about my week, about the power of attorney documents, and the financial revelation that had reset my family relationships. She listened with growing interest. You just showed them everything? She asked when I finished. Everything. Account balances, investment performance, property values, the whole picture. It completely changed how they saw my financial decisions. And they stopped treating you like you were confused? Immediately. Once they understood I was successful rather than struggling, they couldn't maintain their previous assumptions. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I've been wondering if I should have that conversation with my daughter, but I've enjoyed having my financial privacy. Privacy is valuable, I agreed, but not when it's being used as evidence against your competence. That's exactly what's happening. She thinks my investment choices prove I'm becoming impulsive and need guidance. Maybe it's time to prove her wrong. We talked for another few minutes before Eleanor said she needed to think about it, but I could hear in her voice that the conversation had shifted something for her, just as my children's assumptions had shifted something for me. After I hung up, I realized that this week had taught me something beyond the importance of family communication. It had taught me about the power of visibility, about the difference between being underestimated and being unknown. For years, I'd enjoyed being underestimated. It had given me freedom to act without interference, to make decisions without justifying them to anyone else. But when underestimation became a threat to my autonomy, I'd had to choose between privacy and agency. I'd chosen agency, and I was already seeing the benefits. Sarah's interest in learning about investing. Marcus's request for education about financial planning. Both of them approaching me as a source of expertise rather than an object of concern. But I was also seeing some unexpected costs. My secret had given me a kind of power. The power of surprising people, of revealing capabilities they didn't know I had. Now that the secret was out, that power was gone. I could no longer be the mysterious parent who might have hidden depths. I was simply someone whose depths were now known. It was a fair trade, but it was still a trade. In exchange for being seen clearly, I'd given up the option of being seen differently later. In exchange for respect for my current capabilities, I'd sacrificed the possibility of future revelations. I thought about David again, about what he would have made of this week's events. He'd always believed that honesty was simpler than deception, even when deception seemed kinder. He would have approved of my decision to reveal my financial success, but he would have understood my reluctance to give up the privacy that had protected it. Sometimes, he used to say, The hardest thing about telling the truth is that you can only tell it once. I'd told my truth about money, and it had solved the immediate problem of my children's misconceptions. But it had also committed me to a level of transparency about my finances that I'd never maintained before. Sarah and Marcus would now expect to be kept informed about my major financial decisions, not because they wanted to control them, but because they were genuinely interested in them. It was a new kind of relationship, built on mutual respect rather than protective concern. But it was also a more complex relationship, one that required me to balance my desire for independence with their legitimate interest in my well-being. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the sense that my family finally knew who I really was. It was both liberating and terrifying, this business of being fully seen. But it was also, I realized, exactly what I'd been working toward without knowing it. All those years of building wealth in secret, I'd told myself I was protecting my independence and ensuring my security. But maybe what I'd really been doing was building something impressive enough that when I finally chose to reveal it, no one could doubt my competence ever again. The money had been the means, but respect had been the end. And now, finally, I had both. 3 weeks into our new family dynamic, Jennifer called me with what she described as an urgent question. Her voice carried an edge of excitement that immediately caught my attention. "Della, I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but Marcus said you'd be okay with it. I've been thinking about something since our investment lesson, and I need to run it by someone who actually knows what they're talking about." I was in my home office, reviewing quarterly reports from my property management company, but Jennifer's enthusiasm made me set aside my work. "What's on your mind?" "There's a small office building for sale near my workplace. It's been on the market for 6 months, which seems like a long time, and the asking price has dropped twice. I drove by yesterday, and it looks solid, just dated. I keep thinking it might be an opportunity, but I don't trust my judgment yet." This was exactly the kind of real-world application I'd hoped our investment discussions would inspire. "Tell me more about the property." Jennifer launched into a detailed description that impressed me with its thoroughness. She'd researched the building's history, looked up recent sales of comparable properties, and even spoken with some of the current tenants about their lease terms. Her approach showed genuine analytical thinking rather than impulsive interest. "The numbers work if I can get financing," she concluded, "but I'm nervous about whether I'm missing something obvious. Would you be willing to take a look at it with me?" "I'd be happy to. When were you thinking? Would this afternoon be too soon?" "I know it's short notice, but the seller is considering another offer, and I need to decide quickly whether to make a competitive bid." I glanced at my calendar, which showed nothing more pressing than grocery shopping and a phone call with my financial advisor. "This afternoon works fine. Why don't you pick me up around 2? The building Jennifer had found was a 3-story brick structure in a transitional neighborhood, the kind of area where young professionals were starting to move as downtown rents climbed higher. The exterior needed cosmetic work, but showed no signs of structural problems. More importantly, the location had good visibility and parking, 2 factors that significantly affected commercial property values. Jennifer had prepared a folder with financial projections, comparable sales data, and photographs of similar properties that had sold recently. Her research was more thorough than what I'd seen from some professional investors. "Walk me through your thinking," I said as we stood in the small lobby. "The current owner is an elderly man who inherited the building from his father. He's been managing it himself, but he's tired of dealing with tenant issues and maintenance. That's why it's been on the market so long. He's been inflexible about price and terms." We toured the building together, noting both its strengths and its obvious weaknesses. The tenants we met were professional service providers, a small law firm, an accounting practice, and a marketing consultant, all of whom seemed stable and satisfied with their spaces, despite the dated common areas. "The rental income covers the current asking price," Jennifer continued as we walked through the second floor. "But there's room for improvement. The lease rates are below market, and several tenants are month to month, which means new leases could be negotiated at higher rates." I was impressed by her analysis, but I could also see she was nervous about the size of the commitment. "What's your biggest concern?" "Honestly, that I'm in over my head. Marcus and I have good incomes, but this would be our largest financial commitment outside of our house. If something goes wrong, if I've miscalculated something important, We could lose everything we've worked for. Her honesty was refreshing. Too many novice investors let excitement override caution, but Jennifer was balancing opportunity against risk in a mature way. Those are reasonable concerns, I said. Let's talk through some scenarios. What happens if you lose your largest tenant? I'd need to find replacement tenants quickly, but the space is flexible enough for different types of businesses. Based on my research, this area has low commercial vacancy rates. What about major maintenance issues? I've budgeted for a new roof within 5 years and HVAC updates within 3. The inspection showed the electrical and plumbing are solid. We spent another hour walking through potential problems and Jennifer's proposed solutions. Her planning was thoughtful and conservative, exactly the approach I tried to instill in beginning investors. Jennifer, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why this? Why real estate investment instead of putting your money into stocks or bonds? She considered the question carefully. I like the tangibility of it. With stocks, I'm trusting management teams I'll never meet to make decisions about companies I may not fully understand. With real estate, I can see what I'm buying, I can improve it with my own efforts, and I have more control over the outcome. That's a good answer. Real estate investment isn't passive income despite what some people claim. It requires active management and ongoing attention. Are you prepared for that? I think so. I've been a renter for years, so I understand tenant relationships from the other side. And Marcus is handy with basic repairs, which should help with maintenance costs. As we drove back to my house, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Sarah about career choices. Jennifer's interest in real estate investment seemed like a natural extension of her analytical skills and her desire for financial independence. But I could also see why she was nervous about taking the leap. Jennifer, what would make you feel more confident about this decision? Honestly, having someone experienced tell me I'm not being foolish. Someone who's made these kinds of investments successfully and can spot problems I might miss. Would you like me to review your financial projections in detail? I could look at your numbers with fresh eyes and point out any potential issues. Her relief was visible. Would you really? I don't want to impose, but Marcus said you're incredibly thorough with financial analysis. I'd be happy to help, but I want to be clear about something first. This is your decision to make, not mine. I can help you evaluate the opportunity, but I won't tell you what to do. I understand. I just want to make sure I'm being realistic about both the risks and the rewards. That evening, Jennifer emailed me a comprehensive financial analysis of the property investment. Her projections included multiple scenarios, sensitivity analyses for different occupancy rates, and detailed budgets for improvements and maintenance. The work was sophisticated enough to impress professional investors. I spent 2 hours reviewing her numbers and research, checking her assumptions against my own knowledge of local real estate markets. Her analysis was conservative in all the right places and aggressive only where the data supported optimism. Most importantly, she'd structured the deal so that even negative scenarios wouldn't threaten her family's basic financial security. I called her the next morning with my assessment. Jennifer, your analysis is excellent, conservative where it needs to be, realistic about potential returns, and thorough in its consideration of risks. If you're comfortable with the financial commitment, I think this could be a good investment for you. Really? You don't see any major problems I've missed? I see minor issues that could become major problems if ignored, but you've identified most of them already. Your maintenance budget is realistic, your revenue projections are conservative, and your financing plan preserves your liquidity for unexpected expenses. So you think I should do it? I think you've done the work necessary to make an informed decision. Whether you should do it depends on your risk tolerance and your long-term goals, not on my opinion. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Can I ask what you would do in my position? 20 years ago, when I was starting out, I would have been too scared to take this kind of risk. 10 years ago, I would have been too eager and might have overlooked important details. Today, with the analysis you've done and the safeguards you've put in place, I would probably move forward. That's what I needed to hear. Thank you, Della. Just remember, this is only the beginning. Real estate investment is a long-term commitment that requires ongoing attention. Are you prepared for that? I am. And honestly, after seeing what you've accomplished with property investment, I'm excited about the possibility of building something similar. 2 days later, Jennifer called to tell me she'd submitted an offer on the building. I offered $15,000 less than the asking price, but with flexible closing terms. The seller's agent said they'd have an answer by Friday. How are you feeling about it? Nervous but excited? Marcus is supportive, which helps. And knowing that you think my analysis is sound gives me confidence that I'm not making a huge mistake. Friday afternoon brought good news. Jennifer's offer had been accepted with minor modifications to the closing timeline. She'd become a commercial real estate investor, and her excitement was infectious. Della, would you be willing to help me with one more thing? What do you need? I want to set up systems for managing the property professionally from the beginning. Proper accounting, tenant communication procedures, maintenance scheduling. I don't want to end up like the current owner, overwhelmed by details and eager to sell. This request showed exactly the kind of forward thinking that separated successful investors from those who struggled. I'd be happy to help. Let's start with the basics and build a management system that can scale as your portfolio grows. My portfolio? You think I'll buy more properties? If this investment goes well, and if you continue to approach opportunities with the same thoroughness you've shown, I think you'll find real estate investment addictive. Most successful investors start with one property and gradually build from there. Over the next week, Jennifer and I worked together to establish systems for her new investment. We set up separate business banking accounts, created spreadsheets for tracking income and expenses, and developed templates for tenant communication. I introduced her to the contractors and service providers I used for my own properties, knowing that reliable vendors were crucial for successful property management. The process reminded me of my own early days as an investor, when every decision felt monumental and every system had to be created from scratch. But Jennifer had advantages I hadn't had: access to experienced guidance and the confidence that comes from thorough preparation. I keep thinking about what you said about real estate being addictive, Jennifer mentioned during one of our planning sessions. Is that what happened to you? Did you always plan to own multiple properties? Not at all. I bought my first rental property because I needed more income than my savings accounts were generating. I had no grand plan for building a real estate portfolio. But success bred confidence, and confidence led to opportunity. When did you know you were good at this? I thought about her question, remembering the gradual shift from anxiety to competence that had marked my early investing years. Probably when I sold my second property for twice what I'd paid for it. That's when I realized I wasn't just lucky. I was actually developing skills that produced consistent results. How long did that take? About 3 years from my first purchase. But those were 3 years of constant learning, frequent mistakes, and occasional terror when things didn't go according to plan. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. I'm prepared for the learning curve. What I'm not prepared for is the judgment from people who think real estate investment is too risky for someone my age. Who's been giving you judgment? My parents, mostly. They think Marcus and I should stick to traditional investments, like mutual funds and savings accounts. They keep asking, what happens if the property market crashes, or if we can't find tenants? I understood their concerns, but also recognized the pattern of older family members discouraging younger ones from taking calculated risks. What do you tell them? I try to explain my research and planning, but they just see the risk, not the opportunity. They think I'm being reckless with our financial security. Are you being reckless? I don't think so. We're not borrowing more than we can afford, we're not counting on appreciation to make the investment profitable, and we're not putting all our money into one asset class. This is one component of a diversified financial plan. Then trust your analysis and let your results speak for themselves. Some people will always prefer the perceived safety of traditional investments, even when those investments don't generate the returns needed to meet their long-term goals. Is that what happened with your children? Did they not understand your investment choices? I smiled, remembering Sarah and Marcus's shock when they'd learned about my portfolio. They didn't know enough about my investment choices to have opinions about them. But yes, if they had known, they probably would have thought I was taking too many risks. And now? Now they're asking me to teach them what I know. Success has a way of changing people's perspectives. The conversation with Jennifer got me thinking about the broader patterns I'd observed in family financial dynamics. Adult children often wanted to protect their parents from investment risks, while parents often wanted to protect their children from financial mistakes. Both impulses came from love, but they could also limit opportunities for growth and learning. That weekend, Sarah called with news that surprised me. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation about real estate investing, and I want to run something by you." "I'm listening." "There's a property in my area that's been on the market for months. It's priced as a single-family home, but it's zoned for multifamily use. I think it could be converted into a duplex, which would significantly increase its value and rental potential." Sarah's idea was more complex than Jennifer's office building purchase, requiring renovation expertise and zoning knowledge, in addition to financial analysis. But it also had the potential for higher returns if executed properly. "Have you researched the conversion requirements?" "I've spoken with contractors about the feasibility and costs. I've also checked with the city about permit requirements and timeline. The numbers work if I can get the property at the right price." "What kind of returns are you projecting?" "After renovation, each unit should rent for about $1,500 per month. Total investment, including purchase price and conversion costs, would be around $250,000. That's a gross yield of about 14%, which seems strong. I was impressed by her analysis, though I could see areas where her real estate experience was outpacing her investment knowledge. "Have you factored in vacancy rates, maintenance costs, and property management expenses?" "Vacancy shouldn't be a major issue in this market, but I've budgeted for 2 weeks of vacancy per unit per year. Maintenance costs are harder to estimate for a renovation, but I've added a buffer for unexpected issues." "What about your exit strategy? Are you planning to hold this as a long-term rental, or would you consider selling after the conversion?" "I haven't decided yet. The rental income would be nice, but the profit from a sale might give me capital for additional investments." We spent an hour discussing the details of her proposed project, and I found myself both excited by her initiative and concerned about the complexity of what she was considering. Renovation projects could be highly profitable, but they could also spiral out of control if not managed carefully. "Sarah, this is a much more ambitious project than I started with. Are you sure you want to take on this level of complexity for your first investment property?" "I've been managing real estate transactions for years, Mom. I understand the renovation process, I have good relationships with contractors, and I know this market better than most investors. Those are all advantages, but managing a transaction is different from managing an investment, and managing other people's renovations is different from managing your own. What would you do in my position? I'd probably look for a simpler first project, something that generates income without requiring major improvements. But I also might not have your professional expertise to draw on. So you think I should pass on this opportunity? I think you should make sure you're prepared for the challenges this project will involve. Renovation timelines always run longer than planned, costs always exceed budgets, and tenant-ready properties always need more work than they appear to need." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "You're right. Maybe I should start with something less complicated and work up to renovation projects." "There's no hurry, Sarah. The real estate market will provide plenty of opportunities. Better to choose one you can execute well than one that stretches your capabilities too far." "That's good advice. Would you be willing to help me look for alternatives? Something more straightforward for a first investment?" "Of course. Let's find you a property that lets you learn the fundamentals without taking unnecessary risks." Over the next few weeks, I found myself serving as an informal investment advisor for both Jennifer and Sarah. It was a role I'd never expected to play, but one that felt natural given my years of experience and their genuine interest in learning. Marcus, meanwhile, had taken a different approach to implementing our investment discussions. Rather than jumping into real estate, he decided to focus on building a more sophisticated stock portfolio. He'd started with index funds, but was gradually adding individual stocks after researching companies in industries he understood through his sales work. "I'm not ready for real estate yet," he told me during one of our regular check-in calls, "but I am ready to move beyond basic mutual funds. I've been studying the companies I sell to, and I think I understand their business models well enough to evaluate them as investments." That's a smart approach. Investing in companies you understand through your professional experience gives you insights that other investors might not have. Exactly. And if I'm wrong about a stock, the loss won't affect my ability to pay my mortgage or send my kids to college someday. Marcus's cautious approach was different from his wife's willingness to take on real estate investment, but it was equally valid. Both strategies involved building expertise gradually and taking measured risks based on careful analysis. The transformation in my family's financial conversations had been remarkable. 6 months earlier, Sarah and Marcus had been concerned about my ability to manage basic expenses. Now they were asking for my guidance on investment strategies and seeking my approval for their own financial decisions. But the change went deeper than just investment advice. Our entire relationship dynamic had shifted from one of protection and concern to one of mutual respect and collaboration. They no longer saw me as someone who needed their help. They saw me as someone who could help them. The shift wasn't without its complications. Both Sarah and Marcus sometimes asked for my opinion on decisions that were ultimately theirs to make, and I had to resist the temptation to be overly directive. They were adults building their own financial futures, and my role was to provide guidance, not control. I also had to adjust to being seen as a financial expert, rather than just their mother. It was flattering, but also somewhat isolating. Our conversations now focused heavily on money and investments, sometimes at the expense of other aspects of our relationship. One evening, as I was reviewing Jennifer's monthly property management reports, Sarah called with a question that had nothing to do with real estate or investing. "Mom, I know we've been talking a lot about money lately, but I wanted to ask you about something else. Do you ever miss Dad more now that you're successful? Like, do you wish he could see what you've accomplished?" The question caught me off guard, partly because we'd been so focused on financial topics that personal emotions hadn't come up much recently. "I miss your father every day," I said honestly, "but I don't think success has made that feeling stronger or weaker. It's just made it different." "Different how?" "When I was struggling financially after he died, I missed him because I needed his help, his partnership in solving problems. Now I miss him because I want to share good news with him, because I think he'd be proud of what I've built." "He would be proud," Sarah said softly. "He'd also be amazed. Dad was always conservative about money." He was, but he also believed in taking care of family. And that's what all of this has been about. Making sure I could take care of myself and maybe help you and Marcus when you needed it. "Is that why you kept it secret for so long? Because you were building something to take care of us?" I considered her question carefully. "Partly, but also because I was building something to take care of myself. I never wanted to be in a position where I needed to depend on anyone else for my basic security. And now you don't. Now I don't." After we hung up, I realized that Sarah's question had touched on something I'd been avoiding thinking about. The financial independence I'd built was substantial enough to last for the rest of my life, even if I never earned another dollar. But it was also more than I could realistically spend, which meant that a significant portion of it would eventually become Sarah and Marcus's inheritance. That reality was creating a new kind of pressure in our relationship. They were both working to build their own wealth, but they were also aware that they would someday inherit mine. I could see them trying to balance independence with expectation, wanting to succeed on their own while knowing that their financial future was already largely secured. It was a delicate dynamic, one that required careful navigation from all of us. I wanted them to continue building their own financial skills and independence, but I also wanted them to know that they had a safety net if they needed it. The solution, I realized, was transparency combined with clear boundaries. They needed to know about my wealth because the secret had become counterproductive. But they also needed to understand that my financial success didn't diminish the importance of their own efforts or guarantee specific outcomes for their inheritance. I decided to schedule a family meeting to discuss these issues directly rather than letting them remain unspoken. Sarah, Marcus, and Jennifer deserved to know where they stood, and I needed to clarify my own expectations about our evolving relationship. The meeting was set for the following Sunday, and I spent the week preparing for what I expected would be our most important family financial conversation yet. Sunday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made my backyard feel like the perfect setting for important conversations. I'd set up the patio table with coffee and homemade apple cake, creating an atmosphere that felt serious but not confrontational. Sarah arrived first, carrying a notepad and wearing the focused expression she brought to important business meetings. Marcus and Jennifer came together, both looking slightly nervous about what they probably expected would be a discussion about inheritance and family financial planning. I waited until everyone was settled with coffee before beginning what I knew would be a conversation that would define our family's financial relationships going forward. I asked you all here because I think we need to talk openly about how our family dynamic has changed since I shared my financial situation with you, I began. These past few weeks have been wonderful in many ways, but I've also noticed some tension around expectations and assumptions that I think we should address directly. Sarah set down her coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. What kind of tension do you mean? I've noticed that you're all working hard to build your own financial independence, while also being aware that you'll someday inherit substantial assets from me. That creates a complicated dynamic that I don't think any of us have fully processed. Marcus shifted in his chair. Are you saying we shouldn't be thinking about inheritance at all? I'm saying we should think about it clearly and honestly rather than letting it create unstated expectations or guilt about your own financial decisions. Jennifer spoke up hesitantly. I have to admit, knowing about your wealth has made me question whether I should be taking risks with real estate investing. Part of me wonders if I should just play it safe, since we'll eventually inherit enough to be financially secure anyway. This was exactly the kind of thinking I'd been worried about. Jennifer, that's precisely the conversation we need to have. Because my wealth shouldn't discourage you from building your own, and inheritance shouldn't be treated as a guaranteed retirement plan. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared with documents that outlined my current estate planning and my thoughts about how inheritance should work in our family. I want to share some specific information with you so we can all make decisions based on facts rather than assumptions. The first document I handed them was a summary of my current will and trust arrangements. As it stands now, my estate would be divided equally between Sarah and Marcus after providing for some charitable donations and specific gifts to people who've been important to me, like Jennifer and my godchild Ava. Sarah scanned the document quickly. This shows Jennifer inheriting a significant amount directly, not just through Marcus. That's correct. Jennifer has become family, and she's also shown real aptitude for financial management. I want to recognize both of those facts in my estate planning. Jennifer looked genuinely surprised. Della, I never expected. I know you didn't. That's part of why I'm including you. You're building your own wealth because you want financial independence, not because you're counting on mine. I handed them the second document, which outlined my thoughts about inheritance, timing, and structure. I've been thinking about whether it makes sense to wait until I die to transfer significant assets to you, or whether there might be benefits to making some transfers while I'm alive. Marcus studied the document carefully. You're talking about giving us money now instead of leaving it to us later? I'm talking about the possibility. There are tax advantages to lifetime transfers, and there might also be personal advantages to seeing how you handle substantial assets while I'm still here to provide guidance if needed. Sarah's expression had grown thoughtful. But there are also risks to giving away assets while you're still alive. What if you need that money for your own care as you age? That's a valid concern, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation openly. I need you to understand the scope of my financial resources so you can give me honest advice about how to balance my own security against potential benefits to you. I handed them the final document, which was a detailed projection of my financial needs for the rest of my life under various scenarios. This analysis shows that even accounting for inflation, potential long-term care costs, and market fluctuations, I could comfortably live on less than half of my current assets. Jennifer was reviewing the projections with her new investor's eye for detail. This assumes pretty conservative investment returns going forward. Exactly. I'd rather overestimate my needs and have money left over than underestimate them and run short. Marcus looked up from the documents. So you're saying you could afford to make substantial gifts now without compromising your own financial security? I'm saying it's possible, but I want your input on whether it's wise. There are emotional and family dynamic considerations beyond just the financial math. Sarah had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now she set down her papers and looked directly at me. Mom, can I ask you something that might sound selfish? Of course. If you give us money now, how do we know we've earned it? How do we know we're not just getting handouts that discourage us from building our own success? This was the question I'd been hoping one of them would ask. That's exactly why I wanted to have this conversation. I don't want my wealth to undermine your ambition or make you feel like your own efforts don't matter. So what's the solution? I think the solution is to create a structure that rewards and supports your own financial growth, rather than replacing it. For example, I could match your investment contributions dollar for dollar up to certain limits, similar to an employer 401k match. Jennifer's eyes lit up with understanding. So we'd still need to save and invest our own money, but our efforts would be amplified by your contributions. Exactly. Or I could provide low-interest loans for investment properties, giving you access to capital while ensuring you have skin in the game and real accountability for results. Marcus was nodding as he considered the possibilities. That would let us take on larger projects than we could finance on our own, but we'd still be responsible for making them successful. Right. And if an investment failed, you'd still owe the loan amount, so there would be real consequences for poor decisions. We spent the next hour discussing various structures that could accelerate their wealth building while preserving their motivation to make smart financial choices. The conversation was more sophisticated than I'd expected, with all three of them contributing thoughtful ideas about how to balance support with accountability. There's another aspect of this we should discuss, I said as we moved on to dessert. How do you want our family financial conversations to evolve going forward? Sarah tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? I mean, do you want me to be actively involved in your investment decisions, or would you prefer that I provide advice only when asked? Do you want regular family meetings about money, or should these discussions happen more organically? I'd like some structure, Jennifer said immediately. Maybe quarterly check-ins where we can update each other on our progress and ask for guidance on specific decisions? Marcus agreed. I think regular meetings would be helpful. It would give us deadlines for making decisions and ensure we're all staying on track with our goals. What about investment collaboration? I asked. Are there opportunities for us to invest together in projects that might be too large for any of us to handle individually? This question sparked an animated discussion about potential joint investments. Sarah mentioned several commercial properties that would require more capital than she could access alone. Marcus talked about investment opportunities he'd identified through his business connections that might benefit from group funding. Jennifer suggested they could pool resources to invest in larger real estate projects that would provide better returns than smaller individual purchases. We could form a family investment partnership, Sarah suggested. Pool some of our capital and make decisions collectively about how to invest it. That could work, I agreed, but it would require clear agreements about decision-making, profit sharing, and exit strategies. Business partnerships can strain family relationships if they're not structured properly. Marcus looked thoughtful. Maybe we should start small. Pick one investment opportunity and see how we work together before committing to a larger partnership structure. That's wise, I said. Test the relationship before making it more complex. As the afternoon wore on, our conversation evolved beyond specific financial strategies to broader questions about family values and legacy. I found myself sharing thoughts I'd never articulated before about what I hoped my wealth would ultimately accomplish. When I started building this portfolio, I told them, I was focused on my own security and independence. But as it's grown larger, I've started thinking more about what it could do for future generations of our family. What do you want it to do? Jennifer asked. I want it to provide opportunities, not dependencies. I want it to amplify your own efforts rather than replace them. And I wanted to create a foundation for financial education and responsibility that gets passed down to your children. Sarah smiled. Speaking of children, there's something Marcus and I should probably tell you. Marcus grinned and reached for Jennifer's hand. Jennifer's pregnant. We're having a baby in the spring. The news hit me like a warm wave of joy mixed with a sudden awareness of how much our family financial planning had just changed. That's wonderful news, I said, meaning it completely. How are you feeling about it, Jennifer? Excited and terrified in equal measure, she admitted. Especially now that we're talking about family wealth and financial responsibility. I keep thinking about what we want to teach this child about money. You have time to figure that out, I assured her. But it does add another dimension to our planning. We're not just talking about your generation anymore. We're talking about building something that will benefit your children too. The pregnancy news shifted our conversation toward longer-term thinking about family, financial education, and wealth transfer across multiple generations. We talked about the importance of teaching children about money management from an early age, about the challenges of raising financially responsible kids when they know they'll inherit substantial assets, and about the values we wanted to instill around wealth and responsibility. "I don't want our child to grow up entitled," Jennifer said firmly. "I want them to understand that money is a tool, not a goal, and that financial independence comes from your own efforts, not from your family's bank account." "That's exactly the right attitude," I told her. "And having those conversations early will make them much easier to navigate as your child grows up." As the sun began to set and our conversation wound down, I realized that this afternoon had accomplished something important beyond just clarifying financial arrangements. We'd established a framework for ongoing family financial collaboration based on mutual respect and shared values rather than assumptions and unstated expectations. "Before you all leave," I said, "I want to make one thing clear. These conversations about inheritance and financial support, they don't change the most important thing, which is that I'm proud of all of you for your own accomplishments. Sarah, your real estate business is successful because you work hard and serve your clients well. Marcus, your sales career is thriving because you're good at what you do. Jennifer, your property investment is going well because you did thorough research and careful planning. My wealth doesn't diminish any of that." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We know that, Mom. But it's good to hear you say it." After they left, I sat alone on my patio as the evening air grew cool and thought about how much our family had changed in just a few months. The conversation that had started with my children questioning my financial competence had evolved into sophisticated discussions about multi-generational wealth planning and family investment partnerships. But more than that, it had fundamentally altered how we related to each other. Sarah and Marcus no longer saw me as someone who needed their protection. They saw me as a partner in building our family's financial future. I no longer had to hide my capabilities or downplay my success. I could be fully myself in their presence. The transformation hadn't been easy for any of us. Sarah and Marcus had to confront their own assumptions and biases about aging and competence. I had to give up the privacy and independence I'd valued for years. We'd all had to learn new ways of communicating about money, power, and family relationships. But the result felt more honest and more sustainable than what we'd had before. Our relationships were now based on who we actually were, rather than who we thought we were supposed to be. Monday morning brought a call from my financial advisor, Janet, who wanted to discuss some changes in my portfolio allocation. But she also had questions about the family financial planning I'd mentioned during our previous conversation. "Della, I've been thinking about your family situation," Janet said after we'd finished reviewing my quarterly reports. "It sounds like you're moving toward a more collaborative approach to family wealth management." "That's a fair description. Why do you ask?" "Because I think you might want to consider formalizing some of these arrangements. If you're going to be making substantial gifts to family members or entering into business partnerships with them, there are legal and tax structures that could be beneficial." "What kind of structures?" "Family limited partnerships, charitable remainder trusts, grantor trusts. There are several vehicles that could help you transfer wealth efficiently while maintaining some control and providing tax advantages." I'd heard of these structures, but had never seriously considered them because I'd been planning to keep my wealth management simple and private. But now that my financial situation was no longer private and my family relationships had become more collaborative, it made sense to explore more sophisticated planning options. "Could you put together some information about these alternatives? I'd like to understand the options before making any decisions." "Absolutely. I'll also recommend an estate planning attorney who specializes in family wealth transfer. You've reached the point where your financial situation is complex enough to benefit from specialized expertise." After I hung up with Janet, I realized that this conversation represented another milestone in my financial evolution. I was no longer just an individual investor managing her own portfolio. I was becoming the architect of a family financial strategy that would affect multiple generations. It was both exciting and daunting. The decisions I made now about wealth transfer and family financial structures would influence not just Sarah and Marcus, but also Jennifer's unborn child. and any future grandchildren. I was creating a financial legacy that would outlast my own lifetime. That afternoon, I called Eleanor Martinez, the woman I'd spoken with about family financial communications several weeks earlier. I was curious about how her own situation had evolved since our previous conversation. Eleanor, it's Della Gibson. I wanted to check in and see how things have been going with your daughter. Della, I'm so glad you called. I took your advice and showed my daughter my investment portfolio. It was one of the most interesting conversations we've ever had. How did she react? Shock, initially, then pride, then embarrassment about how she'd been treating me. It turned out she'd been worried about my spending because she thought I was living on a fixed income that wasn't keeping up with inflation. And now? Now she's asking me to teach her about investing. She wants to understand how I've been so successful with money management. It's completely changed our relationship. I smiled, remembering my own family's transformation. That sounds familiar. The funny thing is, I realize I was partly to blame for her misunderstanding. I'd been so private about my investment success that she had no way to know I was actually thriving financially. My secrecy created the problem I was trying to avoid. That's exactly what happened with my children. Sometimes protecting our privacy ends up protecting us right out of our family's respect and understanding. Exactly. But I have to ask you, do you ever miss the privacy? Do you ever wish you could go back to managing your money without family input and expectations? It was a thoughtful question, one that touched on the trade-offs I'd been reflecting on since my own revelation. Sometimes, I admitted. There was a certain freedom in being underestimated, in making decisions without having to explain or justify them to anyone else. But that freedom came at the cost of authentic relationships with my children. And you think the trade-off was worth it? I think it was necessary. My children were moving toward making decisions about my life based on fundamental misunderstandings about my capabilities. I could either let that happen, or I could correct their misunderstandings. I chose to correct them. Do you have any regrets about how you handled it? I considered her question carefully. I regret waiting so long to have honest conversations about money with my family. I think if I'd been more open earlier, we could have avoided some of the conflict and misunderstanding that led to the confrontation about power of attorney. But you also couldn't have predicted how your investment success would grow, or how your family relationships would evolve. True, but I think I could have found ways to share some of my financial knowledge and experience without revealing the full extent of my wealth. I could have positioned myself as financially competent without necessarily disclosing that I was financially wealthy. Eleanor and I talked for another 20 minutes about the challenges of balancing financial privacy with family transparency. Her situation had evolved differently from mine. Her daughter had been worried about reckless spending rather than confused incompetence, but the underlying issues were similar. After our call, I spent some time thinking about what I would do differently if I could replay the past few years of family financial communication. I realized that while I didn't regret sharing my financial situation with Sarah and Marcus, I did regret letting the situation reach a crisis point before addressing it. In the future, I decided I would be more proactive about correcting misunderstandings and more willing to share information that helped my family understand my actual circumstances. I wouldn't necessarily reveal every detail of my financial situation, but I would make sure they had enough information to see me accurately rather than through the lens of their own assumptions. That evening, Sarah called with an update on her property search. Mom, I found something I think you should see. It's not the renovation project I was considering before. It's a duplex that's already generating rental income but is priced below market because the owner needs to sell quickly. Tell me about it. It's in the same neighborhood where Jennifer bought her office building, which seems to be appreciating faster than other areas. Both units are currently rented to long-term tenants with good payment histories. The seller is asking $220,000, but I think it's worth at least $250,000 based on comparable sales. Why does the seller need to move quickly? Job relocation. He's been transferred to another state and needs to close within 30 days. He's priced it aggressively to ensure a fast sale. Have you seen the property? I toured it yesterday. The building is solid, both units are in good condition, and the rental income would cover the mortgage payments with some cash flow left over. What's your financing plan? I can put down 20% and get a conventional investment property mortgage for the rest. The monthly rental income is about $300 more than the mortgage payment, taxes, and insurance combined. Sarah's analysis sounded much more conservative and realistic than her previous renovation idea. This was exactly the kind of straightforward investment property I'd recommended for someone building their first rental portfolio. It sounds like a good opportunity, I told her. Are you planning to make an offer? I am, but I wanted to run it by you first. Not because I need your permission, but because I value your perspective on real estate investments. I appreciate that. Based on what you've told me, it sounds like a solid first investment property. Conservative enough to be safe, but with enough upside potential to be worthwhile. That's what I was thinking. I'm going to submit an offer tomorrow morning. Let me know how it goes. And Sarah? Yes? I'm proud of you for finding a property that matches your risk tolerance and investment goals. This is exactly the kind of thoughtful approach that leads to long-term success. After I hung up with Sarah, I reflected on how different this conversation had been from our discussions just a few months earlier. Instead of me trying to convince her I was competent with money, she was seeking my expertise on her own financial decisions. Instead of her worrying about my judgment, I was praising hers. The reversal was complete, and it felt natural rather than forced. Sarah had come to see me as a knowledgeable resource rather than a declining parent. And I had come to see her as a capable adult rather than a child who needed protection from financial complexity. Over the next few weeks, all three of my family members' investment projects moved forward successfully. Sarah's offer on the duplex was accepted, and she closed on the property within the seller's timeline. Jennifer's office building was performing even better than her projections, with one tenant requesting additional space and another signing a longer-term lease at higher rates. Marcus had built a small but diversified stock portfolio that was generating steady returns and giving him confidence to take on larger positions. But more importantly, our family financial conversations had become routine rather than extraordinary. We talked about investments and market conditions the way other families talked about sports or politics, as a shared interest that connected us rather than a source of tension or misunderstanding. The transformation felt permanent now. Not just because our individual circumstances had changed, but because our fundamental understanding of each other had shifted. Sarah and Marcus knew I was capable of sophisticated financial thinking. I knew they were committed to building their own wealth rather than simply waiting for inheritance. Jennifer knew she was valued as a family member and trusted with significant financial responsibility. These new understandings created a foundation for ongoing collaboration that felt both exciting and sustainable. We were no longer just a family connected by love and obligation. We were also a family connected by shared financial interests and mutual respect for each other's capabilities. As I sat in my kitchen that evening, reviewing the day's market reports while dinner cooked in the oven, I realized that this was what I'd been working toward all along, even when I didn't know it. Not just financial independence for myself, but financial collaboration with the people I loved most. The money had been important, but the relationships built around the money were what made it truly valuable. I'd started investing to secure my own future, but I'd ended up creating a legacy that would strengthen my family for generations to come. And perhaps most importantly, I'd proven to myself and to my children that being 74 years old didn't mean being confused about money. It meant being experienced enough to make money work in service of the things that mattered most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. 6 months later, I stood in the nursery that had once been Marcus's childhood bedroom, watching Jennifer rock my new granddaughter Emma, while Sarah assembled a crib that came with instructions neither of us could decipher. The room felt alive with possibility, in a way that took me back to when my own children were small, but with an added layer of financial security that I'd never experienced as a young mother. Emma Rose Gibson Chen had arrived 3 weeks early, surprising everyone except Jennifer, who'd insisted throughout her pregnancy that the baby would come on her own timeline. She was right, as she'd been about most things since joining our family. The baby's early arrival had thrown off some of our carefully planned schedules, but it had also given us an unexpected gift. Extra time together before Jennifer returned to managing her growing real estate portfolio. "Mom, can you hold this piece while I figure out which screw goes where?" Sarah asked, looking frustrated with the crib assembly process. I can negotiate million-dollar property deals, but apparently I can't follow basic furniture instructions. I took the crib rail from her and studied the instruction manual, which seemed to have been translated from another language by someone who'd never actually seen a crib. Maybe we should call Marcus. He's better with mechanical things. He's at the office building, dealing with the HVAC replacement, Jennifer said without looking up from the baby. Jennifer's first investment. She'd started calling the property, which made Marcus roll his eyes but also smile with pride every time she said it. The HVAC replacement was exactly the kind of major maintenance issue we'd budgeted for in Jennifer's original investment plan. But experiencing it in real life was different from planning for it on paper. The system had failed during the hottest week of summer, and Jennifer had to coordinate emergency repairs while managing contractors, keeping tenants comfortable, and preparing for Emma's arrival. How's she handling the stress of property management with a newborn? I asked Sarah quietly. Better than I would be. She's got spreadsheets for everything, backup plans for the backup plans, and a property management company on speed dial for emergencies she can't handle herself. Jennifer looked up from Emma and smiled. I can hear you both, you know. And yes, I'm managing fine. The property management company Marcus recommended has been incredibly helpful, especially with tenant relations during the HVAC replacement. Are you having second thoughts about real estate investing? I asked. It's a lot of responsibility to add to new parenthood. Actually, I'm more convinced than ever that it was the right choice. The rental income gives us financial flexibility that we wouldn't have with just our salaries, especially now that we have Emma to think about. Jennifer's confidence had grown substantially over the months since she'd bought the office building. What had started as nervous excitement about her first investment property had evolved into genuine expertise in commercial real estate management. She'd recently started looking at a second property, a small retail center that needed updating but had strong tenant fundamentals. Speaking of Emma's future, Sarah said, finally getting two pieces of the crib to fit together properly, have you two thought about how you want to handle financial education when she's older? We've talked about it, Jennifer replied. We want her to understand money as a tool for creating opportunities, not as something to be afraid of or entitled to. That's wise. I made a lot of mistakes with financial education when you and Marcus were growing up, I admitted. I was so focused on making sure you were secure that I didn't teach you enough about how money actually works. You taught us more than you realize, Sarah said. We learned about budgeting and saving and living within our means. We just didn't learn about investing and building wealth. Because I was learning those things myself at the same time you were becoming adults. I couldn't teach you what I didn't know yet. The conversation was interrupted by Marcus arriving with coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, looking tired but satisfied. The HVAC replacement had been completed successfully, and all of Jennifer's tenants were happy with how quickly the problem had been resolved. Any progress on the crib? He asked, surveying our modest assembly efforts. Some, Sarah said diplomatically. We've identified several pieces that definitely don't go together. Marcus set down the coffee and picked up the instruction manual, studying it with the same focused attention he brought to analyzing investment opportunities. Within 20 minutes, he had the crib assembled and positioned perfectly in the corner where Jennifer had envisioned it. How did you do that so quickly? Sarah demanded. I actually read the instructions instead of trying to figure it out by intuition, Marcus replied with a grin. Same principle that applies to investing, actually. Sometimes the boring approach is the most effective one. As we sat around the nursery drinking coffee and admiring Emma, I found myself thinking about how much our family dynamic had evolved since that confrontational afternoon, when Sarah and Marcus had tried to convince me to sign over financial power of attorney. The change wasn't just about money, though money had been the catalyst. It was about seeing each other clearly, rather than through the filter of expectations and assumptions. I have something I want to share with all of you, I said, pulling a folder from my purse. I've been working with Janet and an estate planning attorney on some new financial structures that I think will benefit everyone. Sarah immediately sat up straighter, her real estate training making her alert to legal documents. What kind of structures? A family limited partnership that will let us pool resources for larger investment opportunities, and an education trust specifically for Emma and any future grandchildren. I handed them copies of the documents, which outlined a framework for collaborative family investing and a separate fund dedicated to ensuring that the next generation would have access to excellent education and financial literacy training. The investment partnership would let us take on commercial real estate projects that none of us could handle individually, I explained. Sarah, you've mentioned several properties that would require more capital than you can access alone. Jennifer, your retail center opportunity might be a good candidate for partnership funding. Jennifer was reading through the partnership documents while gently bouncing Emma. This would let us share both the risks and the returns of larger investments? Exactly. And it would formalize the collaborative approach we've been developing informally over the past few months. Marcus was studying the education trust paperwork. This fund is specifically for Emma's education? For Emma and any other grandchildren who might come along. College costs, graduate school if they choose it, and financial education programs starting from elementary school age. Financial education programs? Sarah asked. Summer camps that teach kids about entrepreneurship and investing, mentorship programs with successful business people, internships at financial firms during high school. I want Emma's generation to understand money from an early age in ways that we never did. The education trust was something I'd been thinking about since Jennifer's pregnancy announcement. I'd seen too many wealthy families produce children who were entitled rather than empowered, who inherited money without inheriting the skills to manage it responsibly. I wanted to make sure that Emma and any future grandchildren would be educated about wealth before they inherited it. There's one more component to this planning, I said, pulling out the final set of documents. I've decided to make some lifetime gifts to each of you now rather than waiting until my death to transfer assets. The gifts I was proposing were substantial, but structured to encourage continued investment success rather than financial dependency. Sarah would receive enough capital to pursue larger real estate development projects. Marcus would get funding to build a more substantial stock portfolio. Jennifer would receive resources to expand her commercial real estate investments. The gifts come with one condition, I added. You have to continue building your own wealth alongside what I'm giving you. These aren't retirement funds, they're acceleration funds. Sarah was reviewing the gift documentation with obvious excitement. Mom, this would let me take on projects I couldn't even consider before. That's the idea. I want my money to amplify your capabilities, not replace your efforts. What about taxes on gifts this large? Marcus asked, showing the practical thinking that had made him successful in sales. The estate planning attorney has structured everything to minimize tax implications while staying within legal limits. Some of the transfers will be loans at favorable interest rates rather than outright gifts, which provides tax advantages while ensuring you maintain accountability for results. We spent the next hour discussing the details of the new financial structures and how they would work in practice. Emma slept peacefully through the entire conversation, unaware that her financial future was being planned with the same care that had gone into decorating her nursery. I have to ask, Jennifer said as we were wrapping up the formal discussion. Why now? Why not wait a few more years to see how our individual investments perform before creating these partnership structures? Because I'm 75 years old, and I've learned that good intentions don't automatically become good results. If I want to see how you handle larger financial responsibilities, I need to provide those opportunities while I'm still here to offer guidance. And because you want to enjoy watching us succeed, Sarah added with a smile. That too. There's something deeply satisfying about seeing your children build something substantial with resources you've provided. It feels like the money is serving its highest purpose. After everyone left that evening, I sat alone in the nursery with Emma, who had awakened and was looking around with the wide-eyed curiosity that newborns bring to their first weeks of life. The room was quiet except for the soft sounds of her breathing and the distant hum of the neighborhood settling into evening routines. I thought about what I wanted to tell her about money when she was old enough to understand such concepts. Not the fearful messages I'd grown up with about scarcity and limitation, and not the entitled messages that some wealthy children received about money being a birthright. I wanted her to understand that money was a tool for creating opportunities and solving problems, but that the tool was only as good as the wisdom and character of the person using it. Your parents are going to teach you about being responsible with money, I whispered to her, but I'm going to teach you about being creative with it. I'm going to show you how to make money work for the things you care about. Emma's eyes seemed to focus on my face as I spoke, though I knew she was too young to understand the words. But something about her alert expression made me think she was already absorbing the emotional tone of financial confidence, rather than financial anxiety. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor Martinez, who had become a regular correspondent since our conversation about family financial dynamics. "How did the family meeting go?" her message read. "Better than I hoped," I replied. "Everyone is excited about the new partnership structures, and Emma slept through the entire financial planning discussion. Smart baby. She'll have plenty of time to learn about money when she's older. For now, she just needs to absorb the security that comes from being born into a family that has its financial act together." Eleanor's observation struck me as particularly insightful. Emma would grow up in a family where money conversations were normal rather than stressful, where financial planning was collaborative rather than secretive, and where wealth was seen as a tool for creating opportunities rather than a source of conflict or anxiety. That foundation would give her advantages that went beyond just inheriting assets someday. She would develop healthy attitudes about money from an early age, watching her parents and grandparents make thoughtful financial decisions and seeing the positive results of careful planning and smart investing. Over the following weeks, our new family financial partnership began to take shape in practical ways. Sarah identified a small apartment complex that would be perfect for renovation and repositioning in a gentrifying neighborhood. The project was too large for her to handle alone, but with partnership funding and my experience in property management, it became feasible. Jennifer's retail center opportunity also moved forward, with Marcus contributing capital in exchange for learning about commercial real estate investing. The partnership structure let each of us contribute our strongest skills: Sarah's market knowledge, Jennifer's property management experience, Marcus's financial analysis capabilities, and my overall investment experience. But perhaps the most significant development was watching how our collaborative approach influenced other aspects of our family relationships. We had become genuinely interested in each other's professional success and personal growth, not just because we cared about each other as family members, but because we had shared financial interests in supporting each other's achievements. "I never expected this," Sarah told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "When we first approached you about the power of attorney, I was thinking about protecting you from financial mistakes. Now I find myself learning from your financial successes and trying to build something similar for myself. What's the biggest difference in how you think about money now compared to 6 months ago?" "I used to think about money as something you earned and spent, and hopefully saved a little of. Now I think about money as something you can use strategically to create more opportunities and more security over time." That's exactly the mindset shift that separates people who build wealth from people who just accumulate savings. And it's a mindset I never would have developed if you hadn't shown us your investment portfolio. Seeing concrete evidence of what was possible changed everything. Sarah's observation highlighted something important about financial education within families. Abstract discussions about investment principles were much less powerful than concrete examples of investment success. My children had needed to see actual results before they could believe that sophisticated wealth building was possible for people like them. Marcus had reached similar conclusions about the importance of practical financial education. "I wish I'd started learning about investing 10 years ago," he told me during one of our quarterly family financial meetings. "I would have made some mistakes, but I also would have had a lot more time for compound growth to work in my favor." "What stopped you from starting earlier?" "I didn't know anyone who was successfully investing in individual stocks or real estate. I thought those things were for wealthy people who had inherited money or made huge salaries. I didn't realize that regular people with middle-class incomes could build substantial wealth through patient investing. And now you're building exactly that kind of portfolio." "Yes, but more importantly, I'm building the knowledge and confidence to continue building it for the rest of my life. That's the real gift you've given us. Not just money, but the understanding of how money works." Jennifer's perspective was slightly different because she had come into our family as an adult and had therefore experienced both sides of our financial evolution. "The most surprising thing to me," she said, "is how much more relaxed everyone has become about money since we started having these open conversations." "What do you mean?" "Before, there was always this undercurrent of financial anxiety in family conversations. Sarah and Marcus worried about your financial security. You seem to worry about their financial futures. and I worried about fitting into a family dynamic I didn't fully understand. And now we all know where we stand. We know what resources are available, what everyone's financial goals are, and how we can support each other's success. It's removed a lot of uncertainty and hidden anxiety from our relationships. Jennifer's observation reminded me of something David used to say about the difference between financial privacy and financial secrecy. Privacy was choosing not to share information that wasn't relevant to other people's decisions. Secrecy was withholding information that affected other people's understanding of important situations. I had thought I was maintaining healthy financial privacy by not discussing my investment success with Sarah and Marcus. But in reality, I had created unhealthy financial secrecy that led them to misunderstand my capabilities and needs. The secrecy had protected my independence in the short term, but threatened it in the long term. The resolution had required giving up some privacy in exchange for greater understanding and more authentic relationships. It was a trade-off I continued to feel good about, especially as I watched the positive effects ripple through our family's approach to money and planning. 1 year after Emma's birth, we held our first formal annual meeting of the Gibson Family Investment Partnership. The meeting took place in the conference room at Sarah's real estate office, giving it a properly business-like atmosphere while still feeling personal and collaborative. The year had been remarkably successful for all of our individual and joint investment projects. Sarah's apartment complex renovation had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget, with all units renting quickly at higher rates than originally projected. Jennifer's retail center was fully leased with stable, long-term tenants who had already requested space expansions. Marcus's stock portfolio had outperformed market indexes by focusing on companies and industries where his sales experience gave him unique insights. But the real success story was how well we had learned to work together as investment partners while maintaining healthy family relationships. We had developed systems for making collaborative decisions, sharing information transparently, and resolving the occasional disagreements that arose in any business partnership. Looking ahead to next year, I said as we reviewed our partnership's financial performance, I think we're ready to take on even larger projects. We've proven we can work together effectively, and we've all developed stronger individual investment skills. What kind of larger projects are you thinking about? Marcus asked. Mixed-use developments, multifamily housing projects, maybe even some commercial real estate in other markets where Sarah's research shows good opportunities. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. I've been looking at some emerging markets in smaller cities where we could get better returns than what's available locally. The key is that we continue to approach new opportunities with the same careful analysis and conservative assumptions that have worked so well this year, Jennifer added. Success can make people overconfident, and overconfidence leads to expensive mistakes. I smiled at Jennifer's wisdom, which reflected the steady judgment that had made her such a valuable addition to our family's financial collaboration. Emma, now walking and starting to talk, was playing quietly in a corner of the conference room, surrounded by toys but occasionally looking up at our conversation with alert interest. Speaking of next year, I said, I think it's time to start Emma's financial education program. She's only 1 year old, Marcus protested with a laugh. Financial education starts with attitudes and emotional associations, not with specific knowledge about investing. Emma is already absorbing messages about money from watching how we handle financial discussions and decisions. I pulled out a folder containing materials I'd gathered about age-appropriate financial education for young children. There are programs that teach toddlers about saving and spending through play activities, books that introduce basic money concepts through stories, and even toys that help children understand the difference between needs and wants. You're serious about starting her education this early, Sarah observed. I'm serious about making sure she grows up with healthy attitudes about money from the very beginning. Too many people develop anxiety or dysfunction around money during childhood and spend their adult lives trying to overcome those early messages. We spent the remainder of our meeting planning Emma's early financial education alongside our own investment goals for the coming year. It felt natural to integrate these planning processes, treating Emma's learning as another important family investment that would pay dividends for decades to come. As I drove home from the meeting that evening, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that afternoon, when Sarah and Marcus had asked me to sign power of attorney documents. The transformation had been so gradual and so positive that it was easy to forget how different things had been just 2 years earlier. I was no longer the underestimated elderly woman whose financial competence was questioned by her own children. I was the acknowledged financial leader of a family investment partnership that was building wealth across multiple generations. I was no longer hiding my capabilities behind a facade of careful spending and financial privacy. I was actively sharing my knowledge and experience to help the people I loved most build their own financial success. The change had required courage from all of us. Courage from me to reveal financial secrets I'd kept for years, and courage from Sarah and Marcus to acknowledge their own assumptions and biases about aging and competence. But the result had been worth every difficult conversation and every moment of vulnerability. We had built something together that none of us could have achieved individually. A family culture of financial collaboration, based on mutual respect, shared knowledge, and common goals. Emma would grow up inside that culture, learning about money as a natural part of family life, rather than as a source of mystery or anxiety. That legacy felt more valuable than any specific dollar amount I might eventually leave to my descendants. Money could be spent or lost or mismanaged, but financial wisdom and healthy attitudes about wealth could be passed down through generations, creating lasting positive change that extended far beyond my own lifetime. As I pulled into my driveway and looked up at the house where this entire transformation had begun, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the path my life had taken. I had started with a goal of building financial security for myself, but I had ended up building something much more significant. A family financial legacy based on education, collaboration, and mutual empowerment. The woman who had been told she was too confused to handle money had become the architect of a multi-generational wealth-building strategy that would benefit her family for decades to come. It was a more complete victory than I ever could have imagined when I first decided to prove my children wrong about my financial capabilities. And the best part was that this was just the beginning. Emma's financial education, our family investment partnership, and our commitment to building wealth together would continue evolving and growing long after I was gone. I had created not just financial assets, but financial knowledge and systems that would perpetuate themselves across generations. That evening, as I reviewed the day's market reports and planned my investment moves for the following week, I smiled at the irony of it all. My children had once worried I was too confused to handle money. Now they relied on my financial expertise to guide their own investment decisions. Sometimes the best response to being underestimated is simply to prove your worth through results. And sometimes those results end up benefiting everyone more than anyone initially imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.